But it's this idea that, the people that you meet on the street every day are important. Again, it doesn't have to be a deep, meaningful conversation, but a smile or a side conversation. Oh, did you hear about this? Keeps that community going, and you really lose that when you have these slum clearances. People can end up being much more isolated.
Hello and welcome to the Essential Scholars podcast. I'm Rosemarie Fike, your host, and today we're going to be learning about Jane Jacobs. My guest today is Dr. Lydia Miljan, author of the chapter on Jane Jacobs in our book, The Essential Women of Liberty. Dr. Miljan is a professor of political science at University of Windsor and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am excited to have the opportunity to chat about a scholar that I admittedly do not know a ton about, Jane Jacobs. So really excited to learn from you.
Well, happy to be here.
So can you tell me a little bit about who Jane Jacobs was, and a little bit about her background and her education, which was a bit unusual?
Yes, I mean, she's an interesting character and personality in as much she's not a typical scholar that we think of as sort of an academic scholar. Primarily, Jane was a journalist. She wrote for a variety of different publications when she was first starting out. She wrote for Vogue, she wrote for a bunch of trade publications, but she really honed her skills on urban planning when she wrote for Architectural Digest. And in that work, she had, really looked at the issue of urban planning. So her education was a little sketchy. She obviously passed, graduated from high school, but she, didn't win any awards. Nobody said, oh, this is the woman to watch in the future. She actually found her teachers boring and tedious. And in fact, she says, I'm glad I didn't do so well in high school because it saved me from a tedious university education. So, she leaves high school, but she says, I really want to be a journalist. And her parents said, well, that's great, but you've got to find some skills because, you got to sort of have two pathways. One, something you love, and one, something you can earn money at. So she went to secretarial school, which is sort of the thing you do as a woman in the the 1930s. So she learns typing and stenography, but she really wanted, even at 18, she wanted to be a journalist. So she gets an unpaid internship at her local paper, the Scranton Observer, and she says to them, I'm going to work for free. Teach me how to be a journalist. So she works for a year for free, and she sort of hones those skills. And then with that, she packs up her bag and she joins her sister in New York City to make it as a journalist in the middle of the Great Depression. So this is not a shrinking violet. And then, while she's in New York, after the first few years, she actually takes, in a sort of a, I guess we'd call it now, I forget what the word would be, but an sort of a auxiliary degree at Columbia, sort of open university kind of courses, and she takes anything she wants, and she does a really great job at that. But sort of that's the extent of her education.
So almost, self-taught in a way. So what is the focus of Jacobs' research? What is the focus of her work? And what influenced her interest in studying what she studies?
Yeah, so she's, she goes to New York, she does some freelance stuff, she takes those courses, and she lands actually a job during the war with the State Department. And then even after the State Department, she writes for this bizarre publication that's put out by the US government called America with a K. And its audience is Russians. So this publication gets translated and it goes to Russia, presumably for Russians to see about American life. And then there's a sister publication that goes to America that's supposed to inform Americans about Soviet life. My suspicion is that neither population actually received these publications. But, even in her America stuff, she talks a little bit about urban planning and poverty issues and things like that. So she's not completely a propagandist for the government, but
Mhm.
that's sort of what this thing is. Anyway, she leaves the State Department, and she works for Architectural Digest. And in that's really that lays the groundwork for the rest of her career, where she's looking at sort of architecture in general, but urban planning in particular. And she says, when you see these plans, so that there was a real movement in the 1940s and 50s that there's, people were saying, we've got too many slums, we've got overpopulation, we've got health concerns, we've got issues with poverty, we need to find better housing. So housing's the issue. And urban planners go, yes, we need to declare areas slums, basically tear it all down and build new places, these big skyscrapers. The model of it, there was this idea of a garden city, is that somehow you could elevate people to the sky and they'd sit in these beautiful towers, and then they could look down on wonderful parkways and things like that. And initially Jacobs thought, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. It sounds better than living in a vermin, infested slum. But then she starts to do some additional research, and she speaks with, sociologists and stuff like that. And she starts to walk the streets of these so-called slums. And she says, wait a minute, they're not crime ridden. I mean, yeah, they've got some deficiencies in their building standards, but those can be reformed. You don't need to get rid of them. And she also sort of notices just sort of what people live like on the street. And she says, this isn't street barbarism. You've got people looking at the street. You've got families congregating. You have a community there, and you have shops, and you have enterprise. And what she observed is that when you tear that down, you don't just displace the people, but you displace the community. And there were, and so she writes a book called, The Life and Death of Great American Cities. And in there, she really explores what is the consequences of central urban planning? What impact does it have on the people? And she says that actually ends up becoming the root cause of crime. And it also displacement of communities. And more importantly, it gets rid of your small business people. Like all those corner shops go away. The tailor, the grocery store, the little corner shop where you can grab a pint of milk, and in its place you get these sterile high rises that are far removed from the street, that you don't have people looking down at the street. And in fact, you're now allowing for bad actors to take hold, and crime increases. And so these are, the so-called projects. And we know now what an abject failure they were. So that's really her big push with that book. And then subsequent other books, she sort of explores similar issues.
And so that seems like it's got a lot of policy relevance for today's world. I know you mentioned in the book that the COVID-19 pandemic has really shaken people's view on what is the future of cities. I also know that post-natural disasters, there's often a push to not just rebuild, but let's rebuild better. Let's turn some places into green space, and let's optimize the structure of our city. How could we use Jane Jacobs' insights to kind of navigate those policy conversations?
Yeah, I mean, Jacobs' perspective was quite interesting. I don't think she was totally opposed to planning. I think she was opposed to strict planning, and this idea that somebody from the outside could tell a community what was best for them. She later in life, she moves to Toronto and actually advises Mayor Crombie when he first gets into office. There's one story about how he had used her book in his classes when he taught at Ryerson, and he goes through, he goes, what can I do that costs no money? And she says, get rid of your zoning bylaws. Stop with this, because you've got to allow for mixed use, and you've got to allow for people to use the resources around them and trust people's own creativity, rather than expect some central planner in an office in downtown Toronto to decide for a community. Allow the community decide for itself. And in fact, it was one of the early successes of Crombie's reign, in that they allowed for certain areas, not all, but certain areas, to have mixed use. So you'd have a building that, let's say, was run down and didn't have a big use. And now people went, oh, we don't have to go through this complicated planning and zoning and expensive process of getting permits, we can say we're going to have, some people might want to convert some of the floors into housing. Some might want to have retail shops, and you'd have a mix of different activities. And for Jane Jacobs, that's the preference, because her idea was that you don't want exclusive districts. So she has a whole chapter on sort of the problem with cities where we say, here is a financial district, here is an entertainment district. She goes, the problem with that is that you end up with deserts at different times of the day. So sure, the financial districts is going to be really busy in the daytime when everyone's in those offices working. But what happens at night? Well, at night they become scary places, and that's where you can have crime. And likewise. So she said a street needs to be used all the time. It's going to be used by different people, but it's the more people you have utilizing it, it's busy, it's active, and it's going to be a safe street. And that's a really interesting insight that she provides, because it sort of moves away from this cookie cutter thing and this utopian vision, and really deals with how people like to live, right? If you're going to buy an apartment downtown, you probably want there to be stuff to do, not just in the morning or in the daytime, but also in the evening. And so that's what sort of her main message is in that kind of observation.
She also you also mentioned in the chapter that she was really focused on the importance of experimentation for vibrant cities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, again, it's sort of this idea that you don't have to have just one vision, and it's the idea that maybe she doesn't have all the answers, and maybe no one person has all the answers, but you should be able to try stuff out, and you shouldn't have government standing in the way of innovation, and that's really what she saw. I mean, she had a huge fight with the central planners. I mean, they decided that not only did they want to clear away slums, and it was very, I mean, let's face it, their policy was very racist. They'd look at a community, and if it was predominantly Black, well, we're just going to label it a slum and then give us a reason to do that. But at one point they wanted to run, it's all about, again, this is the 60s. It was a very strange time. They were all about, cars and putting highways into cities. And she's like, and so at one point they wanted to take Washington Park, which is a real landmark park, and run a highway through it. Now, I mean, certainly that would help with traffic, but it would destroy that community. And we've seen that in other ones. I mean, I live right next door to Detroit, and that's a city that was immensely ruined by highways basically ripping through communities. And her argument there is that you don't want a highway to go through a city. You want it to take people to the city. So as a way to go into that. So, I guess that's a very long way of answering your question, but really experimentation allows for the community to decide. And it's also, in a sense, she was sort of tapping into the Schumpeter idea of creative destruction, which is, capitalism is messy, and not Schumpeter, I mean, and that, it's always rebuilding. There's always competition and innovation. And that competition and innovation does leave some people behind. Like make no mistake, when a company fails, people lose their jobs. But his observation, I think Jacob sort of touches on that, is that even if you lose jobs, what is replaced creates that many more jobs. And so experimentation allows for mistakes to be made, but it also allows for great innovation and change and progress in ways that we have seen over the last 100 years, especially.
How might we facilitate an environment for that experimentation, something that encourages experimentation? Are there certain, institutional rules that Jacobs emphasizes in her work?
Yeah, I think it really is on the whole urban planning landscape and the zoning bylaws and sort of the restrictive uses. I think people living in Vancouver are very attuned to how restrictive it is. And part of it is NIMBYism. I mean, it's our own fault that if you have a property in an area that's seen as one that a lot of people want, you want to maintain your property values, and you're thinking about how you can get the best buck. But when there are so many people needing just reasonable priced housing, the restrictions on the height or the density, or saying you can't have mixed use, makes no sense. I mean, there's got to be some provisions both to allow for people to think about properties in unusual ways, and there's all sorts of so you think about old factories or warehouses, those could easily be converted into some really interesting spaces. And obviously planners like densification, but you've also, you got to reduce those barriers. I think that's sort of one of her main takeaways is that it shouldn't be even one person or a small group of people deciding. It should be people within the community saying these are our needs, and why not have X, Y, or Z option, and having people try it out. And again, if they fail, they fail, and you try something else. I mean, the thing about land, that I think that's a classic real estate term, is that they're not making any more of it. So, we've got to figure out how we can utilize the spaces that we have and encourage people to try new ideas.
One of the interesting things that you mentioned in the chapter is that Jane Jacobs talks about how cities serve as a space to train our children to assimilate to the world. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought it was really fascinating, and it kind of cuts contrary to, I want to say, the parenting mindset of a lot of people today.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if if parents today would buy into this. It certainly is, again, a very different time. Like we're talking, she's writing in the 60s, so kids my age. And so my experience of growing up is that we were on the streets. It was a generation where, in the summer, your mom kicked you out at 9 o'clock and then she'd call you home at dark. And you'd go run wild in the streets. Wasn't quite that.
For us, it was when the street lights come on, it was time to come home.
Yeah. So, and her visions is quite interesting, because it's the idea that kids should be able to play on the sidewalks, and a lot of us grew up doing that, right? You draw out chalk and you'd play hopscotch and stuff like that. You'd be socializing with your friends, and again, it's a different time. We didn't have devices. We only had one TV. It was black and white. It was horrible. So there was nothing to do inside the house except chores. But the other thing I think is just probably more mindful of her is, she says, the thing about city planners, especially at that time, is they were men, and they were thinking of they were planning cities that were women dominated. They didn't plan for men to be involved, and for it to be a societal thing. And so again, if you're carting people out to the suburbs and you have this expectation that it's a single family income, again, the patriarch would go out and work, and then it'd be the mother at home with the kids. That's saying that it's just the mother's job to do the raising of the children. But if everyone's in the cities and the kids are in the streets, well, then they're interacting with men and women, right? They're interacting with workers, which could be both genders. And there's a bigger role for men to play in the day-to-day life of cities, because you're not separating families during the main part of the day. And so that's a really interesting insight, especially considering the time that she was writing.
Yeah, and not only just interacting with men and women, but in cities, you're going to be interacting with a diverse population, a more diverse population than you might interact with in the suburbs. So there might even be, some benefits along the lines of tolerance of people that are maybe different from you.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're going to go to the street corner and you're going to see the person who's, running the newspaper shop, and there's, going to be a candy store, and there's just different people who are in commerce. And I think that's something that's quite refreshing about her work. And it's also, difficult to pigeonhole her, because she's very much pro social justice, but she's also pro small businesses and, allowing for people to make a living.
You mentioned in the chapter that she kind of transcends political divides, that her work is quoted and respected by both liberals and conservatives, and you don't find that many people that you can say that about. So I was wondering, what are some of the real impacts that she had on policy?
Well, certainly she's influenced urban policy, but she also had, so she certainly was part of protest politics. So she had, she had obviously advocated and protested against the Washington Square demolition. Her own community was earmarked for demolition. She was able to stop that. That was, West Greenwich Village, again, an iconic neighborhood.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, I know. there would have been no friends, right?
Right.
But she also protested against the Vietnam War. So she's very adamant against it. And actually, that's the story of why she ends up in Canada, because she had two sons who were coming of age, and so she encouraged her sons to be draft dodgers, and they dropped everything. They left New York, which she loved. She'd lived there for, I think, 30 years. And then they moved to Toronto, and that's where she remains for the rest of her life. So she does have a lot of really interesting policy things. And I think she also, with her work with David Crombie, she had consulted a lot on, should we have, how should we do our transportation? So she's an opponent of some of the highway projects in Toronto. She encouraged different ways of looking at planning in that. And she continued to write while she lived in Canada and was very active on those things.
One of the things that she kind of criticizes about that planning approach, or that revitalizing a community approach, is the displacement of certain people and businesses. Can you talk a little bit about what the effects of that displacement might be?
Yeah, so I'm so glad I was doing this project during the pandemic, because it really brought home to me, I think, a major sort of teaching that she had, and it's this idea of shallow relationships. We talk about our close family and friends like that, and how much we missed them during the pandemic. But the other thing we missed is those shallow interactions, just the person that you nod to on the street. You don't really know their name, but you know them, or the person on the bus or something like that. And she says that those are really important parts of society. And there are natural people who you interact with that are part of that. So, it's the local grocer or the piano teacher, or people like that, where they sort of hold the community together. They communicate with members of the community through gossip or just exchange of information. But it's that keeps us as a part of society, right? If we're only talking to our close friends, we're missing those broader interactions. And so those people on the street, so almost like maybe she informed a Sesame Street, I don't know. But it's this idea that, the people that you meet on the street every day are important. Again, it doesn't have to be a deep, meaningful conversation, but a smile or a side conversation. Oh, did you hear about this? Keeps that community going. And you really lose that when you have these slum clearances, because those jobs, those businesses go away, or they move someplace else. And those high rises don't have that same interaction. For one, people are much more fearful, right? She talks about how you don't have people looking on the street anymore, because there's nothing to see. It's just this wasteland that people are afraid to go into that park because it looks scary. But also, even inside the hallways, they're dark and dingy. People are afraid they really can't look out. If you've lived in an apartment building, you have your door, there's no window into the hallway. And so that allows for, bad actors to take hold, and it makes people more frightened. And so people can end up being much more isolated than they were in that, lower to the street kind of city. And so that was one of the big things she was pushing for in a lot of planning, is that you just can't have these big high rises. I mean, high rises have their place. She does acknowledge that. She says, but they're planned for a much more affluent clientele, people who could afford a doorman, for example. And again, the doorman in a building would facilitate that kind of thing, right? The doorman or woman, greets people by name. They know the gossip of the city. But if you're in a building that doesn't have that, you're much more isolated. And so, everyone has a role. And her thing is that you don't need the police. You can't have the police be everywhere. You've got to have society watch out for each other and be its own sort of structure. And you can sort of imagine, the nosy neighbor, right? The nosy neighbor that's looking out saying, you kids, keep it down out there, kind of stuff.
I definitely had one of those. There was no getting away with anything at my house. My next door neighbor told my mom absolutely everything. But she was one of those public characters that Jacobs talks about. She knew absolutely everything that was going on in the neighborhood. She knew all of the local government conversations. who was sick at church. Like, exactly, if you wanted any kind of information, you would go to her.
Yeah, and that's a perfect role, right? That keeps the kids in check, again, socializing children, but it keeps the community together in some respects because they know what's going on, and because let's face it, the media is not going to cover what happens on your street. That's something that you, as the people who live there, are only interested in.
And when you study cities from kind of a top-down, kind of bird's eye view approach, you miss out on these things that don't seem really important, but actually in practice are really vital to a well-functioning city.
Yeah, and society too. I think, and that really is what she was talking about. Is just like sort of what is that social network that we have, and how can it be facilitated with cities and with how people decide to live together.
One of the things you also mentioned in the chapter is that, in addition to some of her work on cities, she challenged the conventional wisdoms of economics. You mentioned that. What are some of the things that she challenged in economics?
Well, she writes a book later on sort of the economy of cities, and she sort of says, what we've been taught all along is that there's been sort of this evolution of society, and you have to have agriculture first, and then agriculture leads to cities. Mm-hmm. And she says that doesn't make sense. If you look at sort of how things evolve, it's actually done in cities when there's more people and there's competition. So she brings the idea of even agriculture being really something that the exchange of seeds. So if you think about you bring your grain to market, you're bringing it to a city or a town or something like that, and those pieces of grain are going to mix with other grain, and you're going to get different varieties of grain, and then you're going to develop that as it goes on. She says you need the cities to have that happening. So her view is that you had cities first, and then you had development after, which is an interesting approach to it. I mean, she also sort of has this idea that you can't have economic growth without cities, that really you need that exchange of goods and services within a city to have any kind of innovation moving forward. So there's some sort of interesting observations, and those are ones that she does later in life.
Sounds a little bit, Adam Smithian in ways,
Mm-hmm.
That the scope of the market is more expanded when you have cities and people living closer together, so you can divide labor more extensively, which opens the door for the opportunity to innovate a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, she really thinks that innovation happens in cities, that it's that it's just the economies of scale of a city allow for to be disseminated faster. I mean, it's not to say that people living in rural communities don't innovate, but it doesn't get disseminated as quickly, and so that you get much more rapid growth through the exercise of cities. And we see that throughout history, that the growth of cities is that much greater, that's where all the innovation is, and that's where the people are. So you can't innovate without people, essentially, is her basic message. She's got a very positive view of the value of human enterprise and intellect.
So the humans being a very valuable resource.
Exactly.
I want to switch gears and ask you a few questions about her work. What do you think is an idea of Jane Jacobs that is misunderstood? Is there something that you would want the opportunity to kind of set the record straight?
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that I'm trying to think. The thing about the Jane is that people really love her. If you talk to people about her, they're like, oh yeah, it's such a great book. I mean, some people say The Life and Death is a life-altering experience. They found it very inspiring. I mean, I think that in her time, she was, she was loved and hated at the time. I mean, professionals dismissed her, right? So, her people who were wanting to proceed with central planning and thought that experts know best, they would, denigrate her, going, well, she's just a mere mother, I guess apparently.
You mentioned in the chapter Robert Moses being this big intellectual nemesis of hers.
Yeah, because he's the one that was profiting off of demolishing slums. And so he wouldn't want somebody who's writing this book getting all this attention to be criticizing him. And so he was the one that certainly was at war with her and tried to say that, she didn't know what she was doing. Professional architects and planners said she was an amateur, things like that. But over the course of time, her ideas obviously prevailed. If you look at the history of those projects, they have been demolished. They were, at the end of the day, they were terribly built. They didn't serve purpose, and they get demolished in city after city after city, and so people have sort of relooked at her statements. And again, she's not opposed to having densification, but it's got to be in moderation. It's got to be how people live, and I think it's got to be in consultation with the people who live there. I think that certainly people like to have new buildings and clean buildings, but they also don't want to have their businesses destroyed or their community taken away from them.
So really emphasizing the importance of speaking to all of the stakeholders in that community.
Yeah, and again, allowing, and it's about where you put your money. And her position was that, these projects were not cheap. They were very expensive, right? Demolition is expensive. Building these high rises is expensive. So she thought it was a misuse of public funds, right? Because this was effectively public funds that were going on to pay for all of this, and they were hard to, you clear out a slum. Well, you've got to move those people someplace, and so sure, the first few years might have seemed nice, but it fell apart very quickly soon after.
Are there any areas where you might disagree with her work, or any kind of limitations or challenges that you would like to discuss?
Well, I think that, when you read the books, one of the criticism is that she doesn't ground it in a lot of data. She tends to use a lot of anecdotes. But if you look at the notes, she does have actually quite a lot of research behind it. I know I oftentimes when I was looking at it, I was hoping for a little bit more of the statistics. She does sort of talk a little bit about how many businesses were displaced, but it's not front and center. So, academics and certainly like a little bit more evidence-based. But having said that, it's so readable. It's so refreshing to read her writing. She really, her turns of phrases are lovely. And so I can forgive her a lot. She's missing some of that data detail. I think I'd prefer the narrative over that, because I've read enough detailed data reports and fallen asleep to them that I could avoid those for the rest of my life. And, if you can tell me a good story, the thing is that you're going to remember it better. I think her lessons are easily digestible, not just for policymakers and academics, but for the public in general. And really, that's what we want. And that's sort of an ideal, I think, even in academia. And I'm always trying to encourage my students to, don't bore me. Tell me a story. Make this interesting. Make me care about it.
Yeah.
And I think society today has gone too far to clickbait. Like, that's not what we want. We don't want you to be manipulated or to have shocking things, but I think you can convey an interesting story in policy making, and that's going to go a lot further in convincing people than, again, too much data.
Absolutely. What are some of the enduring lessons that we should take away from Jacobs's work?
Well, I think the big one is that central planning, is not going to work. And the idea that you have, bureaucrats or even professionals being able to tell people how they should live is going to be problematic. That, as much as I love education and expertise, you've got to have the public involved in decision making, and you've got to see what, especially for housing, it's such a personal thing where people live, that they've got to be involved. But at the same time, you can't allow a vocal minority to stop development, but there's sort of this interesting balance. You've got, you always have holdouts who say, no, you can't build here because I've always lived here. But you still need to, grow. You still need to allow people to have some sort of housing that's reasonable housing in their communities. And so that's a tough balance. I mean, obviously, tough decisions have to be made by policymakers and politicians, but you need to hear the input. So I think the enduring thing is you can't be demolishing people's homes without replacing it with something better. And for her, the better was always going to be mixed use, that you shouldn't have zoning, you shouldn't have restrictions in that respect, and you should allow people to be innovative with the spaces that they're going to inhabit.
What do you think the future of cities holds? That's one of the things that you open that chapter on Jane Jacobs's work, talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the challenges it raised. Are there particular issues that are related to that we can understand better through Jane Jacobs's work?
Yes. So, I mean, I don't see cities going away. I still think they're really important, but they are changing. And part of it is changing because of the nature of work, right? So many of us can telecommute. And that does change things, because you've got a pressure for people saying, oh, I don't need to spend this huge amount of money for a tiny little apartment in downtown Toronto or Vancouver or whatever, pick your city. I can now live in the countryside. Well, okay. Now, rural areas are becoming more expensive as well. But then there's the other side of it, which is what happens to those businesses in the city that were relying on street traffic, lunch trade, all that kind of stuff. So as an example, just the other day, the federal government's basically said they've ordered their federal employees back to work, saying you got to stop telecommuting and you've got to be at work for a certain number of days. The workers are like, oh, this isn't fair to us, and this is, we're going to make this a collective agreement issue. But in the same news story, you heard from, you saw business owners going, actually, we want them back to work because we are dying here. We had a business plan, that we started this business 5-10 years ago with an expectation that we would have trade, and we're really suffering. So it's an interesting question that employers are going to have to work on, the government, and also the people who provide those services. Like if it's a tough position for us all to be in, right? We love the convenience, but when we go to the city, we still want to be able to go to our favorite coffee shop. Right. Well, that favorite coffee shop can't survive if you're just going to show up once a month. Right. And so these are sort of those bigger questions. And again, this could be creative destruction. It could be that you don't have coffee shops downtown cities anymore. But then you have to wonder, what are those cities going to be used for? Are they just going to be playgrounds for tourists and the wealthy, or are there going to be places that we can live on a day-to-day basis?
What are some other current issues that you think Jane Jacobs' work is relevant for us to understand?
Well, I think it's just the restrictions on building that we see in a lot of municipalities. I've read some of the reports from Fraser on just how difficult and how expensive it is to do any development in the city, and the restrictions put in place. And I think she could offer some insights about how those are being harmful. They're harmful for a number of reasons, right? They delay building, but also they increase the cost. Right? We talk about inflation, and I love it when I hear politicians refer to greed inflation when they talk about the private sector, but they never talk about greed inflation when it comes to governments having increasing fees and taxes and things like that. That also adds to the cost of building a property, right? If you're putting in hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases in development fees, well, those fees are going to be passed on to the consumer who's going to purchase that property. So I think that governments have a really important role to play in reducing the cost of government, because that's a huge barrier. You can't have affordable housing if you're having unaffordable development charges.
And affordable housing is an issue everywhere these days.
Absolutely. Like, as I said, there's pressure on rural communities because people have been moving out of the cities, and there's pressures on the cities themselves. And it's all about what you can afford, right? Who wouldn't want to live in a vibrant city at a reasonable rate, right? I mean, I'm sure there are some people who wouldn't want to do it, but there's far more who would.
I would want to, hands down. Mm-hmm. My husband, he has no desire to live in a big city downtown. But it comes with benefits. All of these vibrant relationships and the diversity of businesses and people around you.
And stuff to do.
Yes.
There's lots more stuff to do in a big city. I mean, I personally live in a small town, and it's boring. I mean, it's fine for me because I'm a boring person, but I can also have the benefit of living next door to a very vibrant city. So I do enjoy the benefits of a city. There's theater, there's concerts, there's sporting, there's, all sorts of recreational activity. And you just can't, a small community just can't compete on that scale.
So before we wrap up today, are there any last words you'd like to convey about Jane Jacobs?
I would just encourage people to read some of her work. And if you only read one book of hers, I would certainly recommend The Life and Death of Great American Cities. I think it's just a lovely analysis of the role of cities. Now, it is dated. It is sort of a picture in time, but I guess, especially since when I was reading it, I was so starved for outside city life. I went, oh yeah, I would really like to be part of a city again and part of society again. And I think she, her turns of phrases and the way she approaches the issue is still refreshing even after this many years.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. For those who are interested in learning more about Jane Jacobs, I highly recommend picking up The Women of Liberty, The Essential Women of Liberty book, and reading the chapter on Jane Jacobs. And there's a great list of references and other resources at the end of that chapter as well. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lydia.
My pleasure. It was nice to do this.
You've been listening to Essential Scholars, a new podcast series that explores the ideas and insights of some of history's most influential thinkers. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe and head over to essentialscholars.org to learn more. See you next time.